"Stay inside," the Apache woman pleaded, but it was too late. Riders surrounded her ranch. The sun had barely begun to rise over the wide, dusty plains when she stepped out of the small wooden house that had been her home for as long as she could remember. The wind whispered softly through the tall grass, carrying the faint scent of earth and the distant smell of smoke from a faraway fire. Her hands, rough from years of hard work, clutched the worn handle of a bucket as she went toward the water trough to feed the horses. Every morning she followed the same routine, waking before dawn, preparing food for the animals, checking fences, and making sure the house was ready for the day. It was a life of quiet labor, a life she had chosen and one she took pride in, but in her heart she felt the heavy weight of unease. Her children were still asleep, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of sage and earth. She glanced back at the house, its simple wooden walls and small windows glowing in the early light. She had built this place with her own hands, with help from her husband when he was home. But now, more often than not, she faced the days alone. Her husband traveled to neighboring towns to trade goods or negotiate with other ranchers. She had learned to be self-reliant, to trust her instincts, and to act swiftly when the situation demanded it. There had been years of peace, broken only by minor troubles, and she knew that life on the frontier required constant vigilance. As she poured water into the trough and let the horses drink, her gaze drifted toward the horizon. A thin cloud of dust caught her eye, moving slowly but steadily across the plains. At first, she told herself it was probably just a group of travelers or a small herd of cattle. Yet something in her chest tightened, a small, uneasy feeling she could not shake. She had lived through many seasons of hardship, and she had learned to read the signs of danger. The dust moved too quickly, too purposefully. Her heart began to beat faster, not with panic, but with that deep, instinctive awareness that comes from knowing the land and the people who rode upon it. Returning to the house, she quietly nudged her youngest child awake. His eyes blinked sleepily, and he murmured a soft protest, still half dreaming of warm blankets and morning light. She hugged him tightly, feeling the warmth of his small body against hers, and whispered, "Stay close today. Stay inside." He clung to her for a moment before finally obeying, sensing the seriousness in her voice even though he did not fully understand. The older children followed, still groggy but alert, their faces reflecting the quiet anxiety that had settled over the household. She moved quickly through the kitchen, preparing breakfast in silence. The small stove crackled as she stirred a pot of cornmeal porridge, the aroma filling the room. Every sound seemed louder today, the creak of the wooden floorboards, the distant crow of a rooster, the faint rustle of the wind against the house. She listened carefully, her ears tuned to the world outside. The land had its own language, and she had learned to hear its warnings. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke, and she frowned, trying to determine its direction. It was not a strong smell, but enough to remind her that trouble could be near. Her children ate slowly, sensing the tension but trusting her guidance. She spoke softly, telling them stories of her own childhood, of her parents, of the lessons she had learned about courage and carefulness. Yet even as she spoke, her mind was elsewhere, scanning the horizon, imagining the possibilities, planning for every worst-case scenario she could think of. The ranch, small as it was, represented their lives, their history, their safety. She could not allow anything to threaten it, no matter the cost. After breakfast, she went outside to check the fences, making sure that each post was secure and each gate properly latched. The horses stirred nervously as she approached, and she felt a flicker of concern. Animals often sensed danger before humans did, and their unease mirrored her own. She calmed them gently, speaking in low, steady tones, reassuring them as she worked. The sun climbed higher and the warmth brought a sense of normalcy, but the shadow of worry lingered. She had learned long ago that peace was fragile on these plains, and that it could be shattered in a moment. She moved to the edge of the property, scanning the rolling hills and distant tree lines. In the far distance, the dust cloud had grown slightly larger, and she felt a cold prickle run down her spine. There was no doubt now, someone was coming, and they were coming with purpose. She returned to the house, her movements swift but calm, and began to secure doors and windows. Every latch was checked, every hinge examined. She gathered her children close and explained, in words simple but serious, that they must stay inside until she gave the word. Fear lingered in their eyes, but trust in her leadership held them steady. She moved quietly from room to room, checking on supplies. She gathered water, extra food, and blankets, placing them where they could be easily reached. She remembered the stories of other families who had been caught unprepared, and she refused to let that happen to hers. The house, humble as it was, needed to become a fortress in these uncertain moments. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear of what was outside, but from the weight of responsibility she carried for the lives within these walls. As the sun reached its peak, the sound of hooves began to echo faintly across the plains. The distant drumming grew louder, unmistakable now, the approach of a group of riders. Her heart pounded, and yet she did not panic. She moved with purpose, keeping her voice calm as she reassured her children. "We must stay inside," she repeated, more to herself than to them, trying to steady her own nerves. The sound of voices carried on the wind, sharp and commanding. She recognized the warning signs of trouble, groups traveling together, armed and determined. It was no longer a matter of instinct. It was real. The family huddled inside as she moved between rooms, checking the doors one last time. She could hear the riders now, shouting commands to one another, their voices harsh and confident. The dust cloud had grown enormous, blotting out parts of the horizon, and the sense of inevitability weighed heavily upon her. She looked at her children, their small faces pale but trusting, and felt a surge of determination. Whatever happened, she would protect them. She would meet this danger with courage, as her mother and grandmother had taught her, as her people had survived countless challenges before her. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the riders drew closer. She knelt by the window, watching silently, taking in every detail, their numbers, their pace, the sound of metal and leather as they rode. Each rider seemed focused, purposeful, a force that could not be ignored. And yet she refused to succumb to despair. She drew a deep breath and whispered to herself, "We will endure, we will survive." Her voice, though soft, carried strength and resolve, and she felt the steadiness return to her hands and mind. She could see the dust swirling higher now, the heat of the day making the air shimmer. The land, usually so familiar and comforting, felt suddenly alien, dangerous. Every instinct she had cultivated over years of life on the frontier told her to prepare for the worst, yet hope remained. She had survived storms, droughts, and countless hardships before. She had endured loss and sorrow, and yet she had always found a way to protect her family. Now she reminded herself it was time to do it again. The children pressed close, sensing the tension, and she wrapped her arms around them. She whispered stories of bravery, of cleverness, of courage, hoping to give them comfort even as fear threatened to take hold. Outside, the riders were closer now, and the low, constant rhythm of hooves against the earth filled the air. She listened carefully, memorizing each sound, each shift in movement. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened next, she would face it head-on. She had warned them, she had prepared them, and now she would act with every ounce of her strength. And so, in that quiet morning that had turned into a tense midday, she waited. Every second brought the danger closer, every shadow and noise a reminder of the fragility of life on the plains. Yet inside, there was courage, determination, and an unbreakable bond of family. The wind swept across the prairie, carrying with it the distant sounds of riders, and she whispered once more, "Stay inside." Even though she knew that the moment of reckoning was nearly upon them, she held fast to her resolve, ready to defend her home, her children, and her way of life, no matter the cost. The morning had begun quietly, almost peacefully, but the sound of hooves grew louder and steadier with each passing moment. From inside the small wooden house, she pressed her ear to the floorboards, listening carefully. Her heart beat faster, but her hands remained steady. The children huddled close to her, whispering questions she did not answer immediately. She knew that speaking too much might spread fear, and they needed calm, even if it was hard to find. Every sound outside made her alert, every movement made her muscles tense. She could hear voices now, clear and distinct, calling to one another. The riders were close. She moved quietly to the window, peering through a small crack in the shutter. A cloud of dust swirled across the plains, and the figures of men on horseback began to appear, moving with precision and purpose. The sight tightened her chest with worry, but she did not allow herself to panic. She had lived through harsh seasons, through storms and sickness, through loneliness on the plains. She knew that fear must not take control, not here, not now. Her first concern was her children. She knelt beside them, holding them close. "Stay quiet, stay low," she whispered. Their small hands clutched her sleeves, and she could feel their tiny hearts racing. She tried to keep her voice soft and calm, though her own nerves were stretched thin. Every sense was heightened: the creak of the floorboards, the flap of the door against its hinges, the sound of wind carrying dust, and distant shouts. She moved like a shadow, careful not to make any noise that could reveal her position or alert the riders to her movements inside. Breakfast had been hurriedly finished, and now the food lay untouched, the smell of cornmeal porridge still lingering in the kitchen. She glanced around the room, noting the positions of furniture and supplies. If the riders tried to break in, she would need to act quickly. She gathered water in heavy containers and placed them near the doors. Blankets were stacked for warmth or protection, and she moved the children to a safer corner of the house. They could see the windows, but the shutters hid them well. Every small preparation mattered. She had no idea exactly what the riders intended, but she knew that the best chance of survival was careful preparation and quick thinking. Outside, the riders moved closer, and the rhythmic thump of hooves against the dry earth became a constant drumbeat. Dust rose around their horses, creating a haze that distorted the horizon. The woman's eyes scanned every detail, every movement, trying to understand their numbers and their intentions. She did not have weapons like those who rode outside. Her strength lay in intelligence, foresight, and courage. She thought of every lesson she had learned from her ancestors, of the stories of bravery that had been passed down to her. Now it was her time to act on those lessons. She moved to another window, this one slightly larger, and looked out with careful eyes. The riders were organized, but they did not yet seem aware of her family's presence. A chill ran down her spine as she realized how close they had come. She could hear fragments of conversation carried on the wind. They were searching, asking questions in low, commanding voices. The air felt tense, almost electric, as though the land itself held its breath. She drew a deep breath and stepped back from the window, telling herself to stay calm, to stay strong. The children whispered softly, "Mama, what are they doing?" The smallest one's voice trembled. She knelt, looking into their eyes. "They are just passing by," she said, though it was not entirely true. "We must stay quiet and stay inside. We are safe here as long as we stay together." They seemed to understand her meaning, though their faces reflected fear. She tried to smile gently, to give them courage even as her mind raced with possibilities. Every second now mattered, every decision could mean the difference between safety and danger. As the sun climbed higher, the riders began to spread out, circling the house carefully. The dust swirled around them, and the sound of hooves and voices mixed with the wind. The woman could see their shadows stretching long across the plains. She stayed low, moving quietly to check each door and window again. Latches were tightened, Furniture shifted to block possible entry points, and water and blankets were placed strategically. Her hands moved with purpose, even though her heart thumped rapidly. She had done everything she could think of to protect her family. The children stayed huddled together, watching her with wide eyes. She knelt beside them again, whispering encouragements. "You are brave," she said. "You are safe because we stay together." She touched each of their heads gently, feeling the warmth of their small bodies. Even in moments like this, she tried to remind herself of the love that held them together, the bond that made them strong. Fear could not break them, not if they clung to one another and followed her guidance. Outside, one of the riders dismounted and moved closer to the house, inspecting the fences and the land. His shadow fell across the windows for a moment, and she froze, barely breathing. The child next to her squeezed her hand and she whispered, "Stay calm. Don't move." She knew that every sound, every movement could be noticed, and she moved silently to ensure the children remained hidden. The rider looked around carefully, checking the ground for tracks, the fences for weaknesses. She held her breath as he passed the house, moving along the edge of their property. Minutes passed like hours. Every distant shout, every crack of a branch under a horse's hoof made her pulse race. Yet she did not panic. She reminded herself of her strength, of her experience, of the many challenges she had survived before. She thought of her husband, far away on his travels, and imagined what he might do in her place. She could not rely on anyone else. She was the protector now. Every decision, every small action mattered. She felt the full weight of responsibility, and yet she embraced it with quiet determination. The sun beat down, and the dust continued to swirl. The riders were still circling, still cautious, and she realized they were trying to figure out if anyone was home. She whispered again to the children, telling them to stay silent, to stay hidden, and to trust her. They obeyed, their small hands clutching one another, their wide eyes watching her every move. She moved carefully through the house, checking once more that nothing could give them away. Every latch, every door, every window was secure. The house was small, humble, but it was all they had, and she would defend it with every ounce of strength she possessed. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. The rider's presence was felt even if they were not always visible. Shadows moved across the ground, horses shifted, and voices carried on the wind. She whispered quietly to herself, repeating the lessons of her ancestors, recalling every story of cleverness and courage. She planned silently, thinking about what she would do if they tried to enter, how she would protect her children, how she would hold them together. Fear threatened to rise, but she held it back with every breath. Then suddenly, one of the riders shouted and the others responded. Their voices carried across the plains, sharp and commanding. She could feel the change in energy, the sense that they were aware of the house now. She moved closer to the children, holding them tightly. "Stay inside," she whispered. "We are safe. We must stay calm and brave." The dust swirled thicker now, the sun making the air shimmer, and the sound of hooves and voices grew louder. She could feel the tension in her bones, the sharp edge of anticipation that comes just before an encounter with danger. Even as the riders drew nearer, she remained focused, calm, and resolute. She had spent her life learning to read the land, to sense danger, to act quickly when necessary. Every sound, every movement, every shadow mattered. She guided her children, prepared the house, and stayed alert, ready for whatever came next. The wind blew across the plains, carrying the sounds and dust of the approaching riders, and she whispered once more, her voice steady, carrying strength. "Stay inside." And in that moment, as the afternoon sun climbed high in the sky, she knew that the next moments would test all her courage and all her preparation. But she also knew that she would not let fear rule her. She would protect her children. She would defend her home. She would face whatever came with every ounce of her strength, every lesson she had learned, and every memory of the stories of bravery that had shaped her life. The riders were near now, circling, searching, their presence undeniable. She held her children close, whispered encouragements, and waited, poised, ready and unbroken. The quiet life of the ranch had ended, replaced by a tense, dangerous anticipation, but inside, the strength of a mother and the courage of a family held firm. The sound of hooves grew louder, closer, until it filled the air like a rolling drum. The woman pressed herself against the wall of the small wooden house, her children huddled around her. Every instinct told her that the riders had discovered the house. She could see the dust clouds moving faster now, and the sound of voices carried more urgency. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had prepared for this moment, and she would act with the courage that had carried her through so many challenges before. From the corner of her eye, she saw one of the riders approach the fence, inspecting it closely. He moved slowly, as if searching for any sign of weakness, while another stayed near the trees, keeping watch. She knew they were cautious, careful, and skilled. But she also knew that she had something they could not see, knowledge of her home, the land, and the way to use every small advantage to protect herself and her family. She whispered again to the children, "Stay quiet. Watch and listen, but do not move." The first rider stepped closer to the house. The boards creaked slightly under the wind, and she held her breath, praying that the sound would not carry. Her hands moved quickly to adjust a shutter, blocking the light that might reveal their presence. The children pressed their faces to her sides, wide-eyed, and she could feel their small hearts beating fast. She stroked their hair gently, murmuring, "We are safe. Trust me." Even in the midst of fear, she needed them to feel that strength, that calm confidence. Outside, the riders began to circle more deliberately. They called to each other, pointing at different parts of the property, and the sound of distant hooves stamped the dry earth. She could hear the soft clinking of their equipment, the swish of leather against saddles. They were assessing the ranch, but she was ready. Every door had been secured, every window checked, and the children were safely tucked away. She knew that if they attempted to enter, she would have to be clever and swift, using the knowledge of her home and her instincts to guide them. Minutes passed like hours. The dust hung in the air, thick and dry, and the sun reflected off the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. She moved quietly, checking that everything remained in place, that nothing would betray their presence. Her mind raced with possible scenarios. What if the riders tried to break a door? What if they came through a window? What could she do to buy time to keep her family safe? Every option had to be considered, every action planned, even as the danger drew closer. One of the riders dismounted and moved closer to the barn, where some of the family's livestock were kept. The horses in the corral stirred nervously, and she could hear them whinnying softly. She held a blanket over the children's ears, whispering reassurances. The rider seemed to inspect the area carefully, walking slowly around the fencing, looking for signs of people. She watched every movement, memorizing the pattern of his steps, the way he scanned the ground. She could feel a small sense of control returning. Knowledge was power, and she had it. The children clung to her tightly, their eyes wide with fear. She whispered stories of her childhood, tales of clever escapes and clever thinking, hoping to distract them and calm their nerves. "When I was your age," she said softly, "I learned that courage is not about never being afraid. It is about acting even when you are afraid." Her voice, though quiet, carried a steadiness that gave them hope. They pressed closer, listening, absorbing her words, feeling the calm that came from knowing someone brave was guiding them. Suddenly, one of the riders glanced directly toward the house. Time seemed to slow. She could see the shadow of his horse pass over the wall, and she held her breath. The children froze. She whispered again, "Do not move." The rider stopped, scanning the area carefully, then turned away, apparently satisfied that no one was outside. She exhaled slowly, feeling a wave of relief mixed with tension. They were close, they were dangerous, but she had bought herself precious moments to think, to plan, to act. The sun climbed higher, casting harsh light across the property. Dust swirled in small whirlwinds, and the riders moved methodically, circling closer and closer. She moved silently from room to room, checking that all doors and windows were secure. She had placed water and blankets in strategic spots, prepared hiding places, and arranged the furniture to provide small barriers. Every detail mattered. She whispered to herself, reminding herself of the stories of her ancestors, of women who had protected their families through cleverness, patience, and courage. Then she noticed movement near the edge of the yard. One rider was closer than the others, moving carefully along the fence line. She studied his position, noticing the gaps in the fence and imagining how he might approach the house. She whispered to the children, telling them to stay low and to breathe quietly. She felt her pulse quicken, but her mind was sharp. She would not allow panic to take over. Every sound, every shadow, every detail of the landscape mattered. She was in control of what she could control. The rider near the fence seemed to hesitate as though unsure. She took this moment to adjust the shutters again, blocking a small gap that could have revealed them. She moved with precision, silently, every step careful. The children watched her with wide eyes, absorbing her calm determination. She whispered again, "We are safe. Trust me." Even as the danger loomed, she reminded herself that fear was only one part of the challenge. Action, preparation, and courage would guide them through. The other riders continued their patrol, moving in small groups, circling around the property. Their voices carried on the wind, giving her small clues about their positions and intentions. She listened carefully, memorizing every detail, planning her next move. She knew they would soon decide whether to attempt entry or move on. She had to be ready for either. She whispered to the children, telling them stories of clever escapes, of women who had protected their homes and families against impossible odds. She could see the hope returning to their faces, a small spark in the midst of fear. Suddenly, a shadow passed across the window. One rider had approached the house more closely than the others. She held her breath, keeping the children low and quiet. She moved silently to another window, checking that the shutters blocked any light or movement. The rider paused, looking around, then slowly moved away. Relief washed over her, but she did not relax completely. She knew that the situation was still dangerous, that the riders were careful and deliberate, and that they could return at any moment. She whispered to the children, "We are safe for now. Stay calm." Time passed slowly. The riders seemed to be communicating quietly, their voices low but firm. She listened, learning their positions, their patterns. She realized that they were searching for signs of people, but so far, her preparations had kept them unaware of her family's presence. She felt a quiet pride in her cleverness, in her ability to stay calm under pressure. But she also knew that this was only the beginning. The situation could escalate quickly, and she had to be ready for every possibility. The children were growing restless, but she kept them close, telling stories, singing softly, and whispering words of courage. She moved silently, checking once more that every door and window was secure. The horses in the corral had calmed slightly, but the tension in the air was still heavy. She whispered again to herself, reminding herself that she had survived storms, sickness, and hardship before. She would survive this as well. She would protect her children, and she would not allow fear to take over. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the riders' movements became more deliberate. She could see them coordinating, spreading out, and preparing for what might come next. She realized that she would soon have to act more directly if they attempted to enter the house. Every plan she had made, every preparation she had done would be tested. She whispered to the children, holding them close, "Stay quiet, stay strong. Trust me." Their small hands clutched hers, their wide eyes focused on her. She felt the full weight of responsibility, but she also felt the strength that came from love and determination. And so, they waited, each moment stretching longer than the last. Outside, the riders continued their careful patrol, circling, scanning, and assessing. Inside, the woman guided her children, prepared her home, and remained vigilant. The tension was almost unbearable, but she held fast. She had faced danger before, and she would face it again. Every sound, every shadow, every movement mattered. She whispered once more, "We are safe. Stay inside." In that quiet, tense afternoon, she knew that the real test had not yet begun. But she also knew that courage, preparation, and love would guide her through the challenges ahead. The riders might surround the house, they might threaten the property, but inside, the strength of a mother and the bond of family would hold firm, unbroken, and ready for whatever came next. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, and the heat of the day had given way to a slight coolness that swept across the plains. Inside the small wooden house, the woman could feel the tension stretching tight in every muscle of her body. The riders were still outside, circling the property, their hooves stamping the dry earth in a steady rhythm that seemed to echo through the walls of the house. Her children clung close, their eyes wide and faces pale, but she held them tightly, whispering words of reassurance. "We are safe here," she said, "and we will find a way to protect our home." She knew that time was slipping away. The riders were persistent, careful, and determined. Their voices carried clearly now, speaking in low, firm tones that suggested they were planning their next move. She listened closely, noting the direction of their steps and the patterns in their movement. Every small detail could provide an advantage. Her heart raced, but her mind remained sharp, analyzing and planning. She realized that she would have to take action if they drew closer. The house could not hold forever, and she would need to use every ounce of cleverness and courage she possessed. Her first thought was to ensure the children were hidden as well as possible. She led them to a corner of the house where the shadows fell heaviest and the windows were partially blocked by furniture. They crouched low, huddled together, their small hands clinging to her clothes. She whispered gently, telling them stories of bravery and clever thinking, trying to keep their minds focused on hope instead of fear. "Remember," she said softly, "courage is not the absence of fear, but acting even when we are afraid." Their faces reflected a mixture of awe and trust, and that small spark of calm gave her strength. Outside, the riders had begun to approach more closely. She could see their shadows stretching along the ground, and the dust swirled thick around them, making it hard to see clearly. One rider dismounted and moved toward the fence near the barn, inspecting the area carefully. Another seemed to be heading toward the house itself. She held her breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavy on her shoulders. She had to act quickly and with precision. Every sound, every movement, every detail mattered. She moved silently through the house, checking each window and door again. She had placed water, blankets, and small objects to use if necessary to slow anyone who tried to enter. She realized that she might have only one chance to protect her family if the riders tried to come inside. Her mind raced with possibilities. What if they tried the door? What if they came through a window? She had to be ready for every scenario. She whispered instructions to herself, rehearsing what she would do, how she would guide the children, how she would stay calm no matter what happened. The children whispered softly, asking questions, but she answered only briefly, keeping her voice steady and calm. "Stay low, stay quiet," she said. "We will be safe if we remain together and follow the plan." They pressed closer, drawing comfort from her presence. She could feel their small hands clutching hers, and the warmth of their bodies reminded her of why she needed to be brave. She had faced storms, sickness, and loneliness on these plains before, but this was different. This was a direct threat to everything she loved, and she would meet it head-on. She moved to the kitchen area and gathered a few supplies that might help if the riders attempted to breach the house. She filled containers with water, stacked blankets, and even found a few old cooking tools that could serve as small barriers. Every object, every detail, could provide an advantage. She realized that cleverness and preparation might be more important than strength in this moment. The riders were skilled and determined, but they did not know the house as she did. She could use that knowledge to protect her family. A sudden shadow crossed the window and she froze. One of the riders had come closer, approaching from the side of the house. She held her breath, keeping the children low and silent. She observed the rider carefully, noting his movements, and then slowly backed away, moving to another part of the house where the shadows were deeper. The children followed her quietly, trusting her completely. She whispered again, "We are safe. Stay calm." The rider paused, looking around carefully, but eventually turned away. Relief washed over her, but she knew that this was only temporary. The danger was still real, and she would have to continue her careful vigilance. The wind shifted slightly, carrying dust and the faint sound of voices. She listened closely, trying to determine what the riders were planning next. Their movements were deliberate, cautious, and she realized that they might try to enter the house if they became suspicious. She needed to be ready. She gathered the children in the center of the house, holding them close, and whispered words of encouragement. "We are clever," she said softly. "We will protect ourselves and we will stay safe." The children nodded, their faces reflecting both fear and trust, and she felt a renewed sense of determination. She moved quietly to check the doors and windows once more. Every latch was secure, every shutter closed tightly. She had placed furniture strategically to provide barriers and hide the children. She whispered instructions to herself, rehearsing the steps she would take if the riders attempted entry. Her mind was sharp, focused, and prepared. She had spent her life learning to read the land, to anticipate danger, and to act quickly. Now all those lessons were being put to the test. The riders were circling, still searching, still assessing. Their voices carried clearly on the wind, and she could hear fragments of conversation. They were cautious, aware that someone might be inside the house. She realized that this was the moment to use her knowledge of the home and the land to her advantage. She whispered to the children, telling them to stay low, to stay quiet, and to trust her. They clung to her, wide-eyed, and she felt the warmth and strength of their presence giving her courage. Suddenly, one of the riders moved closer to the back of the house. She watched silently, memorizing his path and noting any gaps in the fences or openings that could allow access. She whispered instructions to herself, planning carefully. If they tried to enter, she would guide the children to a safe corner, use obstacles to slow them down, and stay calm no matter what happened. Every detail mattered, and she would not allow panic to take over. She had prepared for this, and now it was time to act with precision. The children whispered softly and she stroked their hair, speaking gentle words of reassurance. "We are safe," she said. "We are strong. We will face this together." She moved silently through the house again, checking every window, every door, every corner. She could hear the soft clinking of the riders' equipment, the sound of hooves against the ground, the faint rustle of wind carrying dust and leaves. She focused on these sounds, using them to understand the movements outside and anticipate the next steps. Hours seemed to pass in the tense stillness. The sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the plains. The riders' voices became softer, more cautious, as though they were realizing that something was amiss. She could feel a small spark of hope. Her careful planning and vigilance had kept them unaware of the children's presence. She whispered encouragements, telling them stories of cleverness and courage, keeping their minds focused and their spirits strong. They listened intently, drawing strength from her calm determination. Then a sudden shout came from outside, startling the children. She held them close, whispering soothing words. "Stay quiet," she said. "We are safe. Do not worry." The riders seemed to have discovered something nearby, but not the house itself. She realized that her preparations had worked. The obstacles, the careful hiding, and her vigilance had kept the children safe. Relief and pride mingled with the tension, but she did not relax. She knew that the danger was not over and that the next moments could bring new challenges. She moved quietly to check the perimeter once more. The riders were still searching, still circling, and she realized that she would need to be ready for anything. She whispered instructions to herself, planning each step carefully. If they tried to enter, she would guide the children to safety, use obstacles to slow them down, and stay calm no matter what. She felt the weight of responsibility heavy on her shoulders, but also the strength of determination and courage. She would protect her family, no matter the cost. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the plains, the riders seemed to slow their movements, perhaps realizing that the house was empty of visible people. Inside, the woman held her children close, whispering words of reassurance and hope. She had faced a dangerous situation with careful planning, clever thinking, and courage, and she had kept her family safe. She knew that the danger was not entirely gone, but for now, they had survived. The bond of family, the lessons of her ancestors, and her own strength had carried them through. And in that quiet evening, as the sun set and shadows stretched long across the land, she whispered once more, "We are safe, we are brave, we will endure." The riders were still outside circling, but the house remained a fortress and her children were protected. In the stillness of the evening, she knew that courage, preparation, and love had seen them through the most tense and frightening hours. She held her children close, feeling the warmth of their small bodies, and took a deep breath, ready to face whatever the night might bring. The sun had disappeared below the horizon, leaving a soft, dim glow over the plains. Shadows stretched long and cold across the land, and the wind carried the faint scent of dust and earth. Inside the small wooden house, the woman held her children close, listening carefully to every sound. The riders had moved slowly through the property for hours, circling, searching, but now the quiet had begun to settle once more. Her heart still pounded from the tension of the day, but she could feel a small sense of relief. They had survived the immediate danger. The children clung to her, their wide eyes still reflecting fear, but also a growing sense of trust. They had watched her remain calm, make careful decisions, and act with courage when it had mattered most. She whispered gently, "We are safe now. The danger has passed, at least for tonight." She brushed their hair from their faces, feeling the warmth and softness of their small hands in hers. The fear that had gripped them all day began to ease, replaced by exhaustion and a quiet comfort in her presence. Outside, the wind stirred the dust on the plains. The riders had moved away, their distant voices fading into the twilight. She could hear the faint sound of hooves disappearing over the horizon. For now, it seemed they had given up searching. She allowed herself a slow breath, savoring the moment of calm. The house, small and humble, had withstood the tension, and her family was safe. She looked around the rooms, noting the small signs of disruption, the blankets that had been moved, the chairs that had been shifted, but nothing had been broken, nothing had been lost. She knelt beside her children, whispering softly, telling them stories of her childhood and the lessons she had learned about courage and resilience. "Even when the world seems dangerous," she said, "we can find strength inside ourselves. We can face challenges, protect those we love, and endure." The children listened intently, absorbing her words. Their small hands still clutched hers, and she felt the bond of family grow even stronger. Love, trust, and courage had carried them through the tense hours, and now they could begin to heal from the fear. As the first stars appeared in the sky, she moved quietly through the house, checking each window and door one last time. Every latch was secure, every shutter closed, but she did not feel the same tension she had felt before. The immediate threat had passed, and she allowed herself a small sigh of relief. She looked out one window, seeing the vast plain stretching into darkness, calm and empty once more. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying a sense of peace that contrasted with the fear of earlier hours. She gathered her children together in the center of the house. "We will get through this," she said softly. "We are safe tonight, and tomorrow we will continue our lives. The world can be hard and there are dangers, but together we are strong." They pressed close, listening to her voice, feeling the warmth and calm that she radiated. Her heart swelled with both relief and pride. She had faced danger with courage, had guided her children, and had protected their home. The lessons of bravery, cleverness, and love had carried them through. She thought of the day's events, the circling riders, the tension, the fear, and reflected on her own strength. She had relied on her instincts, her careful preparation, and her knowledge of the land. She had acted with calmness under pressure, and her children had learned from her example. Even in the most frightening moments, she had remained focused, thinking several steps ahead, protecting those she loved most. She realized that the day had tested not only her courage, but also her patience, wisdom, and ability to remain calm under pressure. The children began to relax, their small bodies pressing against hers as they felt safe for the first time in hours. She told them simple stories of bravery from her own life and the lives of those who had come before her. Tales of ancestors who had protected their families, used clever thinking to overcome challenges, and remained strong even when the odds seemed impossible. The children listened, their eyes wide, but also beginning to shine with the realization that courage could exist even in the face of fear. The night grew darker, and the wind carried a chill across the plains. She moved through the house quietly, checking that everything was in order. She made sure the children had water, blankets, and a safe space to rest. Her mind, though still alert, began to slow. The immediate threat was gone, and now it was time to tend to the small comforts of home. She whispered soft reassurances, sang a gentle lullaby, and watched as the children began to drift into sleep. Exhaustion finally overtook their fear, and they rested in the safety of her presence. Outside, the world returned to its quiet rhythm. The dust settled, the wind moved gently across the plains, and the distant sounds of the riders disappeared completely. She stepped outside for a moment, taking a slow, deep breath. The land stretched wide and calm before her, and she felt a mixture of relief and gratitude. The ranch had endured, the house had protected them, and her family remained unharmed. She allowed herself a small smile, feeling the strength of her determination, the wisdom of her preparation, and the power of love and courage. She looked at the stars beginning to dot the sky, thinking of the lessons of the day. Life on the plains was unpredictable and sometimes dangerous, but it also offered moments of beauty, calm, and reflection. She had faced a direct threat and had emerged intact, stronger for the experience. She realized that courage was not just about fighting or fleeing. It was also about careful thought, planning, patience, and the quiet determination to protect what mattered most. The children stirred in their sleep, and she returned to them, brushing their hair gently from their faces. "You are safe now," she whispered. "We have endured, and we will continue to thrive. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, but we are ready." She held them close, feeling the warmth of their small bodies, and allowed herself to rest, knowing that the day's trials had passed. The fear, though still a memory, had been overcome by resilience, cleverness, and love. She spent the rest of the night in quiet reflection, thinking of the events that had unfolded. The circling riders, the tension, the careful planning, and the courage she had relied on, all of it had brought her family through the day safely. She thought of her ancestors, who had faced dangers and hardships in times long past, and felt a connection to their strength. She understood that bravery was passed down not just in stories but in action, in thoughtful decisions, and in unwavering care for loved ones. As dawn approached, the soft light of morning began to filter through the windows. She looked out across the plains and saw that the world was once again calm and still. The dust had settled, and the horizon stretched wide and open. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for the safety of her family and the endurance of their home. Though the day had brought fear and tension, it had also revealed the strength, wisdom, and courage that lived within her. She knew that these qualities would guide them through any future challenges. She woke the children gently, letting them stretch and shake off the lingering fear of the previous day. They were quiet but attentive, sensing the calm strength in her presence. She whispered encouraging words, reminding them of their courage, the clever thinking they had witnessed, and the importance of trust in family. The small smiles returning to their faces reflected hope, resilience, and a renewed sense of security. They were ready to continue life, knowing that even in dangerous times, courage and love could guide them through. The ranch, though humble and small, had endured. The house had withstood the circling riders, the children had remained safe, and the woman had proven her courage, intelligence, and careful preparation. She felt a deep sense of pride and relief, knowing that her actions had protected what mattered most. Life on the plains would always carry risks, but she had shown that careful thought, courage, and love could overcome even the most tense and frightening moments. As the sun rose fully over the horizon, casting light across the wide plains, she gathered her children close and smiled. "We are safe," she said softly. "We will continue our lives and we will always protect one another. Courage, cleverness, and love will guide us through everything." The children hugged her tightly, their faces bright with hope and trust. The woman felt the bond of family stronger than ever, and she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, brave and unbroken. In that quiet morning, the world seemed full of possibilities. The plain stretched wide and open, the house stood firm, and her family was safe. She knew that life would continue with its hardships and surprises, but she also knew that love, preparation, and courage had carried them through the most difficult hours. With the children by her side, she took a deep breath, ready to meet the future with strength, wisdom, and